Douglas Murray has spoken out about the dishonesty, the corruption, and the dodgy practices being used behind the scenes at the British Bashing Corporation's flagship news show, Newsnight. This is after an interview with him went viral, not so much for what he said, but because of the way that the BBC decided to respond to the interview with a hysterical, completely imbalanced panel. In The Spectator this week, though, Douglas writes, they say that deaths and taxes are the only certain things in life. I would add BBC bias into that mix. As the years went by, Newsnight, like so many other shows, went from needn't watch to impossible to watch to no one watched. Neither friend nor foe tuned in, and guests were left wondering about the tree falling in a forest fire. And that may well be true. But it's not to say that the way they dealt with Douglas's appearance was at all professional or at all shows that this is an impartial news organisation. So I'll tell you more about what he said in just a moment. Then we'll get reaction from Peter Whittle of the New Culture Forum. But first, a reminder of what actually happened during this interview between Douglas Murray, who had been booked on to promote his new book, and the Newsnight political editor who was hosting that night, Nicholas Watt. Watch.
We should have less Islam in this country. Was that a wise phrase, talking about less Islam?
Well, I think it's perfectly wise phrase, perfectly open to misrepresentation. I think I said it at the encouragement of the BBC.
Well, I'm reading your article.
It was
you
on the
wrote
BBC.
In the Sun.
It was on the BBC. That's why.
I'm quoting what you said in the Sun. Less Islam. Surely, less Islam means less people of the Muslim faith. That means less Sajid Javids, less Sadiq Khans.
Well, that
it
depends.
Means anyone who's a Muslim. That's what it means, isn't it? Isn't that provocative?
I mean, it would also mean less people like the Abaidi family, wouldn't it?
Yes.
I mean, yeah, exactly.
But the point is, you're talking about less Islam. That is Muslim people.
No. Just bear with me, because I know better than you what I think.
But then the shocking thing is, not only had they edited the hell out of that interview to remove a whole load of criticisms that Douglas Murray made about the BBC, they then lined up two of the most deranged people on the left in the United Kingdom to come on and condemn him. Not have any type of balanced argument, just condemn the fact that the BBC even allowed Douglas Murray a platform to express his clearly very important views. First up, the former Lib Dem leader, Jo Swinson. Do you remember? She was the one that sorry, I laugh, because she was the one that told us she was going to become Prime Minister and then didn't even win her seat.
But what did you think of what he had to say about less Islam?
Well, I think you were charitable in saying that he was talking to you earlier. I mean, he was sneering in a very self-satisfied way with a extreme arrogance. I think, frankly, his contribution there was actually about sowing division, about trying to pit groups of people against each other.
And then it gets even more nuts. They put on a guy called Matthew Stadlen. Now, Matthew Stadlen is so desperate that he is unable to get work anywhere apart from GB News, which is so interesting to me because he actually despises GB News with every hard left bone in his body. And what was so hilarious, he was so delighted to be on Newsnight, but then so torn because he was like, I'm so disgusted that I'm on a show that has even allowed Douglas Murray to speak at all.
Douglas Murray is a man who has said of Humza Yousaf, who was the first minister of Scotland, that he had infiltrated the British political system. Humza Yousaf is someone who was born in Britain, born in Scotland. This man is an extremist, in my view, and the Overton window, which we talked about earlier, has shifted so significantly that, and I don't criticise Newsnight for doing it, that he has been given an 8-minute interview on prime BBC television. And that is concerning because more and more people, it seems to me, share his repulsive views. Imagine, just for a moment, Nick, being one of the millions of British Muslims, law-abiding British Muslims, watching him say those things.
We did question him. Now, let's take a...
Well, Douglas Murray has now responded and revealed exactly what went on in a brilliant feature in this week's Spectator magazine. He wrote, "What did that thing that BBC interviewers still think they can do, which is to treat the guest as though you were in the dock, accused of a criminal act, and they are the prosecuting barrister to whom you must answer. Personally speaking, I do not feel this pressure. This is the stage when a BBC interviewer has an author on and asks them how they had the temerity to say certain things in the past. The certain thing on this occasion was a quote from 8 years ago in which I observed that since Islamic terrorism comes from Islam, countries that have less Islam have less Islamic terrorism than countries that have an awful lot of the stuff. Anyhow, the 20-minute interview wound down with some good verbal jousting and no small criticism of the BBC from my side. As it happens, I know one person who still watches Newsnight, and he messaged me afterwards to let me know what had then transpired. The BBC had edited the interview down to significantly less than half the length, which is in its right to do, and had of course left out most of the book stuff, which is what I was there to discuss. It had also cut out anything that made the BBC look bad. It had then pulled its masterstroke, which was to bring out 3 completely unknown people, one of them possibly a former Liberal Democrat leader, to talk about the interview that had just aired. I tend to favour balance in discussions. I especially favour it when the subject under discussion is me. On this occasion, the BBC didn't even try to pretend that it would be balanced. Instead, it brought on 3 people who all agreed it was really quite terrible to interview me at all, and that the Newsnight team should be jolly ashamed of themselves. Defenders of your present column as there were none. Since none of the people in question had any influence, had any livelihood to speak of, I suppose I should be glad that I can provide some kind of cottage industry. Someone in this country has to be in the business of job creation. So Peter Whittle of the New Culture Forum, hilarious from Douglas Murray, by the way, but actually, hasn't he just exposed the truth of how Newsnight operates? And this actually really matters to me. So what they do is when there's a figure who they know might be controversial, who they know might say things that are not palatable to BBC News or palatable to their organisation, they pre-record the interview. They then edit out all of the portions of the interview that dare to criticise the BBC, the British Bashing Corporation, in any way. Then they run their edited version of the interview and bring on a whole load of people to slam the guy who they've just had on. Now, this to me reeks of the scandal that happened in America quite recently, for example, where the credibility of 60 Minutes has come under question because of their editing, their selective editing of the Kamala Harris interview, where they tried to make her look better before the last election. But with Newsnight, it's the opposite. It's let's do anything to stop us looking bad. They clearly didn't trust Douglas Murray to be on live, and they didn't want his criticism of the BBC to be broadcast. I actually think it's a scandal. I really do. But first, the reason you're watching this show is that it's becoming increasingly difficult to trust mainstream media or the so-called fact-checkers who claim to determine which facts are true. And for good reason, given the ongoing debates over free speech, the controversy surrounding Brexit, and how Trump and other anti-establishment politicians are portrayed. But I have the solution. It's called Ground News, and it's the best way to stay informed and cut through media bias and manipulative narratives so you can get the facts for yourself. It has been a game changer for a news junkie like me, and you can see it all for yourself right now. ground.news/outspoken. But I want to show you this incredible website and app in action. So let's take a story that I've been very passionate about, the Supreme Court ruling in the United Kingdom that made the point that women can only be biological adult human females. You can see clearly in one place that over 350 sources around the world covered this story. Ground News instantly shows how it's being covered by the media, broken down by whether they lean to the left or the right. Now, this is called the illustration bias distribution chart. If you scroll down, you can see every headline about the story along with the political bias and ownership of the publication. So you can see quite clearly for yourselves that on the right, the Daily Wire cover the case totally soundly with the headline, UK Supreme Court rules trans-identifying men are not women. Spiked Online, very forthright, declaring women exist, get over it. While the Daily Telegraph looked in depth at the disgraced famous faces who declared trans women are women. By stark contrast, the left-wing National said the result was only a victory for gender-critical feminists, and the Canary ran with a clearly ridiculous headline, "Victory for the far right," as Supreme Court rolls back trans women's rights by 2 decades. Now, I would absolutely love the canary to tell J.K. Rowling to her face that she is far right. Anyway, my favourite feature is the Blind Spot feed. That services upwards of 20 stories daily that receive the majority of coverage from one side of the political spectrum. So if you like the news like I do, the Blind Spot feed is the best way to get a balanced perspective on what's happening. So go to ground.news/outspoken, or if you're watching on YouTube or Rumble, just scan the QR code on screen to subscribe today. Use that address and you will get 40% off the same Vantage plan that I use for unlimited access. So let me repeat the address: ground.news/outspoken. But now back to the show.
Yes, it is. I think that I think as Douglas himself says in the article, basically, as a golden rule, don't do pre-recorded pieces if you can really help it, because there is a danger. I mean, particularly when it comes to interviews and political news, that there's a danger they're just simply going to play around with it. I think he said that himself. I think the thing about this, though, is what it showed was why programs like Newsnight are not watched anymore. They're terrible, right? They're terrible. They learn nothing. I mean, Douglas, frankly, I think they were lucky to have him actually on the program. And when they got these three people, Matthew Stadlin, who might have been up against a number of times, and Joe Swinson, or whatever her name is, I don't know who the other person was, but these are non-entities. These are political non-entities. Yeah. Right? Yeah. I mean, and of no consequence whatsoever. And to see them kind of trying to maul him, in the safety of this bubble was quite pathetic. I mean, I think that despite what we saw there, I mean, Douglas gets his points across very, very well, and I think there'll be a lot of people nodding along with it. But I mean, fact is, this is the BBC all over. Not just, I have to say, the BBC now, as you know well, that essentially BBC might be the leader of the pack, but you've got Sky, which is pretty much the same now, ITV. They've got, all of them have got agendas. So they sort of think they've got, they're looking for a gotcha moment. In that case, with Douglas there, Nick Watt, he was sort of saying, you said we need less Islam. Point that Douglas was making and has made before, and I would agree with entirely, is, look, the more Islamic demographic you have, the greater the chance of extremism, the greater the chance of terrorist attacks, the greater the chance. It's just simple fact. It's common sense. But what surprised me about not just the line of the way it was framed by Newsnight, but also by these people who came on afterwards, was it's as though we have not moved anywhere, or at least they haven't, since about 2005. They're still saying the same thing. It's not washing anymore. Must be the reason why that shows like Newsnight, which is very reduced anyway, as you probably know, just like Question Time is also very reduced compared to like when I was growing up. Everyone watched Question Time and you had really big beasts on it. When it comes to Newsnight, it's now essentially a panel discussion program with none of the authority that it had before.
No, as you say, with non-entities. And Douglas Murray's very honest about the fact, look, he's got a book to sell, and I do understand that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
But Peter, yeah, there was a woman. Look, the problem is the BBC is full of activist journalists. So in response to this interview, there's a former BBC producer, so she's not there anymore, but she's a woman called Karishma Patel. This woman. Now, she actually came out publicly and attacked the BBC for booking Douglas Murray and said the more people hear from racists on BBC shows without all necessary context or pushback, the more reasonable and respectable they will come. This has created fertile ground for the rise of the far right. The BBC should challenge the lack of evidence behind their claims. Now, the point is, she's not a BBC journalist anymore, but she was. And we know that people like her are working with presenters like Lewis Goodall, Emily Maitlis, and John Sopel. I mean, this is a completely morally corrupted organisation. And the fact that they even claim to be impartial anymore is a joke.
Yes, it's I think that the difference, what's happened in recent years, is that people, a wider general public, are now more aware of this. You know, not just in the news programs of the BBC, but also, and I'd say far more insidiously, in the kind of drama and the comedy and the non-news output, where all the time this kind of agenda is being put forward. She's essentially left, woke, if you want to call it that, but it's not just that. Pro-multiculturalism, pro-mass migration, certainly pro-EU, all of that, you know, and pro-climate change. And so you get these people like the journalists you've just mentioned there. I mean, essentially, they don't want anyone who does not agree with them on. It's as simple as that. But what I found interesting, and I return to my point here, is that the people that they got on to kind of have a go at Douglas Murray were of such low caliber. I mean, I think Jo Swinson, she must have been truly a low point, mustn't she, in terms of party leaders? You know, not exactly in a golden era anyway, but terrible. And, you know, those are the only people they could kind of get on to come on a Friday night. Whereas once upon a time, people would probably, you know, fought to get on Newsnight, actually. I think it's Douglas, again, makes that point. The BBC, now, you know, frankly, I grew up on it. I had a residual of fondness for it for quite a long time. That's long gone.
Oh, totally. I'm sorry, Peter. I'm so sick of this idea that as British people, we should be proud of the BBC. I'm actually ashamed of this organisation for so many reasons. I mean, I think they embarrass us on an international stage. But actually, can we just consider the fact that if this were a private organisation that had harboured the most prolific paedophile in British history in Jimmy Savile, who wasn't operating on his own, by the way. There was a full paedophile ring operating for decades at the BBC. Some people will be listening to this thinking, Dan, you can't be telling the truth. I promise you, this is all true. Then Jill Dando, who was the host of Crime Watch, was shot to death on her doorstep just at a time that she was looking to cover, or uncover, I should say, this paedophile ring at the BBC. That case remains unsolved. Then decades later, they have another prolific paedophile, Hugh Edwards, who they allow to read the death, or announce to the world, the news of the death of the late Queen Elizabeth II. That's before you get to the fact that Martin Bashir's shoddy interview, or that's probably an understatement, actually, you know, completely morally insufficient in terms of how it was obtained, interview with Princess Diana, in the view of Prince William, how do I put this? Put Diana on the road to her death. So I would just argue, Peter, that if this was a private company, it would have been shut down many times over, right?
I mean, you mentioned there the Diana interview. In fact, there's a story in the papers today that there are more details about that interview to come out. There's a new book coming out later this year. And in it, you know, the lengths they went to and the various details which are enumerated in that, about how they got that Diana interview. As you say, it's appalling, and frankly, it was all obviously hushed up, because what are we, 2025 now, aren't we? You're talking 1997. Oh no, the interview was 30 years ago, 1995.
Yeah, 95. Yeah. But it obviously, that interview directly led to the late Queen Elizabeth II feeling like she had to intervene and say that the divorce had to take place. And that divorce resulted in Diana refusing her security, which then obviously resulted in the fact that when she was in Paris that night with Dodi El Fayed, she was allowed to get into the car with the very drunk driver. But look, I guess the overall point being here is that the BBC are a crooked and corrupted organisation. And what Douglas Murray has exposed, sure, it's one example. And look, the great thing with Douglas Murray is that even though they edited his interview, he still came out of it looking brilliant, and they look terrible. But it's not the point. How much of this do they do on a constant basis behind the scenes to pump out propaganda rather than news? But look, do stand by Peter Whittle of the New Culture Forum, the director and founder of the brilliant New Culture Forum, because in just 1 minute, a shocking new Hollywood row between J.K. Rowling. She is just under so much attack at the moment. This is now a major star describing her as heinous and a whole load of other things. And what's most shocking is that this is a star of the same channel that is about to air the Harry Potter TV series. Thank you so much for watching Dan Wootton Outspoken. Please click on my face just to the bottom left to subscribe to this brand new independent news source and turn on the notification bell so you'll be alerted to our brand new live shows, uncancelled interviews, and special royal episodes. Outspoken is also now available as a podcast, so you can listen to the show every weekday on the go, wherever you are.